one passed, yes. Well, hello everyone. My name is May Kojatepe and I'm one of the members of the AALL PD committee. The other members are Steve Campitelli, Tiana and Alice Lee. I would like to welcome you to our first Connect, Inspire, Share session of the year. And I'd like to start by acknowledging the Australian Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the first inhabitants of the nation and the traditional custodians of the lands where we live, learn and work. Today, I'm talking to you from Gadigal country, and I pay my respects to the ancestors and families of the Gadigal people and to their elders past, present and emerging. Feel free to put in the lands from which you are joining in today in the chat. Today, we have a very special speaker, Professor Rowena Harper, who to many of us is a familiar face, a familiar name in the field of higher education, but also in particular in the space of academic language and literacies with Rowena's background in that field. Rowena is going to talk about the two AIs that are part and parcel of our life, academic integrity and artificial intelligence. So over to you, Rowena.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. It's so lovely to be here with you all this morning. I see so many familiar names and faces. It's great to be chatting with you all. I'll share a little bit more about myself in a moment as part of my presentation, but I'd also like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands, both on which ECU's campuses are based and on which I'm coming to you from this morning. So I'm just going to get my screen sharing. Okay, I'm hoping you can all see that. Good slides, excellent. Now, okay, here we go. Slides progressing, excellent. Okay, so ECU, just a quick little bit about ECU. ECU has 3 campuses in Western Australia, in addition to a few locations overseas. Our 2 main campuses in the metropolitan area are in Joondalup, that's where I'm normally based, and Mount Lawley. And then we have a campus in the southwest in a town called Bunbury, in the city of Bunbury. As I speak, however, I'm actually coming to you from executive leadership retreat. Our leadership team at ECU has actually gone away for a couple of days down to Albany in the very south tip of Western Australia. And so currently I'm speaking to you from Minyang Noongar country, which you can see I've called out on the slide there. And I've been out and about this morning with my team. We've gone to see some beautiful countryside here in Western Australia. I've been to see the Gap, and we've also been to the wind farm here in Albany, which is particularly incredible. I love wind farms. But while all my colleagues are away at a winery having lunch, I've very happily come back to speak to you all this morning. I'm really pleased to be having this conversation with you today. So, a quick outline of what I'm going to talk about today. First of all, I really like the title of these sessions, you know, the Connect, Inspire and Share. And so I really wanted to emphasize the connecting and sharing this morning. I do think, given this is the first session that you're all having this year, and this is such a hot topic at the moment, I really felt like you all talking to each other is just as important as you're hearing from me, probably more so. So I'm going to be using breakout rooms quite a lot and getting you talking to each other around a few talking points. 90 minutes does feel like a long time, but I'm sure it'll go quickly. The session, I must say, the session doesn't focus a lot on academic integrity per se, although of course I will touch on it, but kind of broader issues around generative AI. But I'm hoping that we'll have plenty of time at the end for questions, just general Q&A, to dig into academic integrity more if that is a topic we feel hasn't been well covered through the session. And I think the question at the bottom there on the slide, I'm not sure I'm going to tackle that very directly in the session. However, I do think that a lot of what I touch on in the session goes towards answering that question. How does ChatGPT help or hinder the embedding of communication development in our courses. And of course, that's an area of work that all of your teams will probably have as part and parcel of what you do. And so I'm sure this will be something that you are all reflecting on in your own ways throughout the session this morning. So a quick bit about me before I start, just to kind of contextualize my position on the issue of ChatGPT and generative AI, and to sort of explain where I come from as a leader around this issue in my own university. So my discipline background, for those who don't know, I've got a PhD in English, and so words and writing and communication are really important to me. And in my view, my training in English, in the discipline of English, has been a really important foundation for all my leadership roles and for my work now as a DVCE. In English, I learned to analyse discourse and to communicate with precision and nuance, and in ways that connect with different audiences, different contexts, to convince, explain, etc. So I think communication and language are actually really, really vital skills. They certainly have been for me. Then after I did my PhD, I started working as a sessional tutor in the discipline I studied in. And there I really saw the difficulty that students face in the transition to university. So I've long been interested in the first year experience and in how we better enable students to transition smoothly into university. And increasingly, this is a kind of whole of education life cycle task, really reaching back into high school, primary school, even to think about how students travel through their educational journey from far earlier than thinking about the transition from year 12 to first year. Then my first full-time academic role was in enabling education, where I really came to understand diversity for the first time. And I loved that work. And I saw so many students not make it through that program because universities still were not meeting students where they were. Then from that program, I moved to the University of Canberra and I found a role as a learning advisor, where I saw really how powerful connections with students in that context are, whether they're one-to-ones or workshops, and how vital the intelligence gathered through those interactions in those all units are for a university. Learning support teams carry really distinct expertise in addition to that organisational intelligence, as do all service units at universities. And that sort of relates to a point I'll come to later, which is really about leveraging the expertise we have across our universities for dealing with something like generative AI. Then if I sort of look at my research has been really eclectic over time. I've tended to be more of an action researcher, researching what I was working on, but most recently it's been focused in contract cheating and academic integrity. And so I do have a really kind of keen interest in how these debates around generative AI will impact the work we do in the academic integrity space, which has been such a big topic in recent years. And also, in addition to all the work that I've done, in kind of student-facing roles and in student-facing units, a lot of my leadership roles have been in curriculum development and staff development. And though working with staff, working with academics in their courses has really highlighted for me the huge pressure that we currently place on curriculum and assessment in the current environment. We ask a lot of our curriculum. And I think we are almost kind of reaching a bit of a tipping point where we need to step back and look very holistically at how we design courses, and particularly how we design assessment across a course. And then I think a sort of another kind of maybe useful point, just to situate where I come from. All my full-time roles in universities have been central. I've never really been situated in a discipline. So I probably bring a somewhat distinct perspective to this issue from other university leaders who a lot of whom have come from within a faculty and have had a long history working within a faculty. I'm not necessarily grounded in a discipline experience, but more in the kind of messy diversity of the student and staff experience within a university. And my experience has really been that universities are these complex ecosystems where every part plays a unique role and has to play a unique and important role. So this sort of just is, by way of background, a way of kind of explaining where I come at this from. So on to ChatGPT. So ChatGPT, we were just chatting before the session officially started. We were chatting about how quickly the timeline has unfolded around ChatGPT. ChatGPT came out in late November 2022. So ChatGPT version 3.5. And in early December, just, you know, while we were kind of winding down, heading towards Christmas and the break, a colleague and I were sort of informally discussing ChatGPT. He reads a lot of tech blogs. I was kind of keeping an eye on it on LinkedIn. And at that point, we were kind of saying, oh, this is probably something we're going to have to keep an eye on, I think. By the time I came back from leave on the 5th of January, it was panic stations globally. So from my first morning back at the university, it was, what are we going to do? Do we need to do something? It was watching the media from around the world, you know, stories of people who've been playing with it, that, you know, stories that it could pass medical licensing exams, that it could pass the bar exam. You know, these things were really worrying, and most of the commentary, all the commentary really was saying that the education sector globally would be the most disrupted by this new technology. And I think although the initial panic was prompted by ChatGPT, the uninitiated among us, like me, soon learned that we really needed to be talking more broadly about generative AI. These technologies have been around for quite some time. It was just that ChatGPT had hit a kind of a threshold of capability that really made everyone sit up and take notice. But as we all probably now know, there are AI tools that cover a really wide range of functions, and we really need to be thinking about generative AI more broadly. So this image, for instance, was generated with AI, was generated with DALL-E 2. Some of you have probably played with it, where you input a text prompt and it will generate an image. So I asked for an Andy Warhol style painting of a robot helping a student with an assignment. So the two questions at this point really in early January were, first of all, do we need to respond? Do universities need to respond? And if the answer is yes, how do we do that? And what principles should guide that response? So I'm going to walk you through my last few months just briefly and my experience of familiarising myself with ChatGPT and its implications. So my background, as you've seen, is not technical, right? So my learning on this was really surface learning, and really just to try and get a sense of the key tenets of the issue. You know, what should university leaders be paying attention to? So I did a lot of reading of LinkedIn, blogs, talked to my counterparts at other universities and talked to colleagues. I think, you know, stepping back, really, we could see that the main things we needed to think about were learning. What does this mean for learning? What does this mean for staff and their teaching? What does this mean for assessment? And what does it mean for the student experience? We could also see in the advice coming from TEXA was that we really need to think about good governance around this. So if we are starting to make changes to assessment, if that's necessary, how are we tracking what those changes are? How are we ensuring that those changes are appropriately governed, considering the higher education standards? It also started to become clear that because this is such an emergent and evolving issue and it's changing so rapidly, that we would probably need some short-term strategies for risk mitigation and then some medium and longer-term strategies. And really, you know, all of this kind of thinking was working towards the first key milestone really for every university, which was determining what the institutional approach was going to be, and then whoever was leading that, convincing the institution, convincing colleagues that it was the right way to go, you know, getting agreement on that approach. So what did I do? Well, don't necessarily need to read this slide, but I'm just going to share a few slides that are examples of how ECU went about solving the problem. So I shared lots of examples of ChatGPT outputs on a range of questions with my executive colleagues and with my learning and teaching leadership group. And they're the Associate Deans Teaching and Learning in every school. So I asked it prompts just like this one. And then this is a copy paste of the output from ChatGPT. And I would kind of showcase this across the university. And at this early point in January, I can tell you that there were people I spoke to who hadn't heard of ChatGPT yet. So really, the early January was still very much trying to do an education campaign to get people to actually pay attention to this as a problem we all needed to have an understanding of. I also explained that it was different from Google and really encouraged staff to educate themselves in how to use it. So, you know, scraped things from LinkedIn to help people write better prompts so they could really see the power and potential of this tool. I shared videos. I shared videos that particularly looked forward, videos that interviewed futurists, for example, who were, you know, talking about their projections of where technology like this might go, so we could think about the potential future risks and directions in our decision making for the now. And I shared some of the commentary that we were seeing about its implications for life, for work, and also the education sector. That, you know, one of the things we talked about, that if ChatGPT kind of, you know, does basic knowledge work for us, then what does that mean for knowledge workers? You know, and a lot of us are knowledge workers in many ways. I also benchmarked as much as possible, as much as it was possible to do at that time, and shared with my colleagues how other universities were responding. And in addition, as I said, you know, we kept a close eye on Texas' position. I think Texas' position has been really measured and wise. They're essentially prompting everyone to go back to higher education standards, which is still really fit for purpose in helping us think through what this means for us. But interestingly, Texas flagged very early that they're assuming that a deep rethink of assessment may be required longer term, and I think that's right. And so I am going to talk about that in more detail later and what I think that might look like. Interestingly, most universities, I think, do have some kind of institutional response, and those can vary. But some universities have opted for now to do nothing, and so I think that's an interesting take as well. And so I'm really keen once we get to discussion to hear what all of your universities are doing. Then I also, in terms of benchmarking, I also particularly benchmarked against universities that ECU often looks to for relevant comparisons. For example, ECU often benchmarks against Deakin. We see ourselves as similar in lots of ways. And I particularly like the great interview that Liz Johnson and Trish McCluskey did on the ABC. It's a really measured, sensible, learning-centred approach. And that was what I was hoping ECU would take. And so that was an important benchmarking moment for us. So where did we arrive? So we kind of did all this work, did all this thinking and trying to upskill people and raise awareness. So this is where we arrived. Our guiding principle at ECU is that generative AI will be a critical tool in the workplace. It's already becoming one now, and it certainly will be in the near future. So students have got to use it productively and ethically, and both of those things are important. In the short term, we kind of reconvened our, or not reconvened, I shouldn't say that. We meet regularly, our learning and teaching leadership group. As I said, it's our associate deans teaching and learning from all of our schools. And that group really came to the fore during COVID. They kind of been meeting regularly prior to COVID, but it was that group that really enabled us during COVID to take a whole of institution approach to the emergency remote pivot. It's a really functional group, in my view, that it really works collectively to drive sort of institutional learning and teaching improvements together. So we convened that group at the start of the year 2 or 3 times a week just to talk about what they were all hearing from their colleagues, what people's concerns were, what people were observing when they were playing with the tool. And it was that group, through that group, that we made collective decisions about how we were going to step forward. We made some targeted assessment variations. So the way we approached assessment change was, because what we were hearing from lots of different disciplines as they put their assignments through it was either, yep, ChatGPT got a distinction on my engineering assignment or my nursing assignment or whatever it was, or that ChatGPT can do part of my assignment, but not all of it. It can do the simpler components, but it can't do the more higher order stuff. And so we were finding that quite a few people needed to make some kind of change to their assessment. But what we encouraged was to take a whole of course view. And by that, what I mean is we don't assure learning outcomes just once in a course. Generally, students have multiple opportunities to develop their capabilities and demonstrate their capabilities against course learning outcomes. So given that there are those multiple points in a course, what we said was that early on in a course, you might want to emphasize a more educative approach to generative AI, and you may not need as many assessment variations because we're going to kind of pick this up over time throughout the course as students move through, and we have more time to think about our assessment design. But, you know, for this semester and next semester in 2023, at the end of a course where the assessments are more about demonstration and integration and kind of capstone sort of assessments, right before students are going to graduate and go out into the world, we may want to take more of an assessment security approach and look a bit more closely at our assessment variations. So that's what I mean by a whole of course view. And we also asked everybody to step more towards authentic tasks rather than away from them. So we didn't want to be kind of reverting back to invigilated exams, which would have been simple, but wouldn't be stepping us towards authentic assessment, which is in our curriculum design policy, is something we really want to move more towards. We also, in addition to those assessment variations, the CLT and Centre for Learning and Teaching and the library rapidly stood up some resources for staff to guide those assessment redesign decisions, and as resources for students to guide them in the use of generative AI. In terms of our academic misconduct policy, it has needed an update. We updated it to include the use of generative AI. We are positioning currently generative AI as very similar to plagiarism, in that we are not necessarily encouraging students to use generative AI in their assignments for a range of reasons that we could discuss a bit later, but we accept that they may. And we accept also that currently our detection tools just aren't capable of detecting the use of generative AI with any kind of reliability. So if we accept that students are likely to use it, then we ask them to do so transparently by referencing it as they would another source, by indicating that they've done so. So we updated our misconduct policy to reflect that. We updated our library referencing guide to show students how to reference when they'd use generative AI. If a staff member suspects that a student's used generative AI without acknowledging it, then it would be investigated in the same way as a kind of case of suspected plagiarism would be. So we also, we announced this approach to staff and students and communicated this approach to staff and students through a global email to staff and to students. And we're trying to put out regular communications to update people as things change. I'll be sending one out about ChatGPT 4, which has come out this week. And what we've also done is we've tried to set up systems for some organisational learning. So we made sure that all our assessment variations were captured in our curriculum management system so we could see what changes were being made and where. And we've also set up a student survey, which is still open at the moment, where I invited students in the global email to give me their views on generative AI and how they wanted ECU to be responding. I haven't seen a lot of the student voice in the debate on ChatGPT and generative AI yet. And so I wanted to make sure we were capturing that at ECU because I really want to know what our students think. In the medium to long term, they didn't respond as quickly as the education portfolio did because they didn't have to, but now we really certainly have our legal teams talking about it. We have our technology teams talking about it. Really every area of the university, I was just discussing with our director of HR this morning, they're really thinking deeply about it. Every area of the university is now beginning to look at what the implications are. And I think particularly the ones that are of interest to me for the education side of things are the kind of ethical and legal issues around copyright, around the material that forms the basis of ChatGPT outputs, the ethics of it, what kind of biases and absences are in its outputs, and what we will what we're already beginning to confront too is the kind of the widespread integration of these technologies into the tools we already use every day. And also now emerging is the kind of multimodal or audiovisual form of AI. In the long term though, we will eventually need to de-risk artifact-based assessments and scale up practice-based assessments. And I'll unpack this in a bit more detail shortly. But this is kind of a one-slide summary of ECU's current position and its view on where we are now in the short term and what we'll be looking at in the medium to long term. So my colleagues at all levels were happy with where we arrived at. They felt that it was clear and consistent, but also measured. And also importantly, that it took us forwards and not backwards. So I did just want to touch here on a couple of real leadership lessons that I've had at ECU that guided us in really thinking about a principle-based approach. When COVID happened in 2020, our university council met and our chancellor, Denise Goldsworthy, spoke about this at the UA conference a few weeks ago. When COVID first struck and our council met, council agreed to one driving principle that would take us through the pandemic, and that was, we will be a better university after COVID than we were before it. And that guided all the decision making, that one simple principle that will be better when we come out of this. And then in terms of the direction given to the education portfolio by our Vice Chancellor, again, we had a simple one-line principle that drove all our decision-making, and the direction from the VC was no student will be disadvantaged as a result of COVID-19. Very simple principle, but it drove all of our work and decision-making. And so those two examples really, I think, they show how important a kind of a crystallizing principle is for empowering people to work autonomously and to make decisions locally that are all pulling the institution in the same direction and will be good for staff and good for students. So that's why we kind of try to arrive at a principle. Our principle is not as inspiring as those other two I just shared, but it's working for now. So what I'm going to do now is, I've been talking for a little while, so I'd like to pause and have a discussion because this is where I'd love you all to start sharing, given I've just shared where ECU's arrived. I'd love for you all to share with each other what your universities are doing. So I've got a kind of a two-part question that I'd love for you to discuss with each other. First of all, what are your unis doing about ChatGPT and generative AI? And two, how is that working so far? How is it working for you and your teams? How is it working for students, and how is it working for staff? So I know the fantastic team is going to help me split you all into breakout rooms. I think that's just going to magically happen behind the scene. Do I need to do anything, May? Do I need to stop sharing?
No, that's absolutely fine. I'm putting 4 to 5 3 to 4 people in a room. That's
Great.
a good number. Yep.
That's perfect.
Okay. And did you say how much time we'll have to discuss?
So time, I'd like a decent amount of time. Let's say if it's 4 people in a room, really, can we have 15 minutes?
Sure.
Yeah, want a good amount of time for discussion.
Okay. So I am opening the rooms. Welcome back, everyone. Oh, Rowena, there you are. Yes.
Back. I'm back. Okay, I'm going to share my screen again. We'll pick up where we left off. So I really hope you all found that to be a useful conversation. I know in the breakout room I was in a couple of really different institutional responses, and interesting hearing about how those were kind of landing with the teams and variously with students and staff. So really, really interesting. I wanted to kind of step on now to looking at what's next for the sector. So we've kind of just covered, you know, the last few months, the initial response to ChatGPT, initial response to generative AI, and where we are now. Of course, this week ChatGPT 4 came out, which is reportedly multimodal. I think the sector's still getting its head around what this will mean, but was doing some reading that you can input images and it can respond to those images with text. So I'm just mulling over in my mind all those academics who did the hard work to set up text-based prompts for their assessments. You know, look at this image, maybe it's a photograph, maybe it's a diagram, and then, you know, write a piece of text that responds to the image. So I'm just, you know, I really fear for those unit coordinators who maybe moved to that approach in semester 1 this year in response to ChatGPT 3.5 as a kind of a way to de-risk their assessment, and they may now need to rethink that again. But I think what this is really showing us is that the acceleration of the capabilities in these tools, and also in the ways in which they will quickly and are quickly becoming integrated into all of our other tools, like the Microsoft Suite, for instance. This will only continue to kind of get worse, if you like, that this will be something we continually need to respond to, that our universities continually need to keep on top of. And that's probably going to be one of our biggest challenges, that kind of pace of change. So thinking about what's next for the sector, and I've presented some of this material before because ChatGPT is such a hot topic. I did a presentation for the TEXA webinar that was co-hosted with Cradle, and I did a presentation. I talked at the panel for the Studiosity Forum, which I know some of you will have attended. So some of you might have seen bits and pieces of this before, but I'm sort of interested now in looking at what's next for the sector and looking a little bit more closely, I think, in some of the implications for the work of academic language and learning educators. So just want to pause while you read this quote. So I think this quote is quite funny from Martin Weller, the EdTechie, because of course we now have ChatGPT, you know, tools that can generate assignment content. We do also now have AI tools that can automatically mark assignments. And so this kind of interesting idea that we can just let the tools take over the university experience, and students and staff can go and have those kind of very old-fashioned esoteric chats in the cafe about philosophy or whatever it might be that they talk about. But this quote reminds me of the posts on Twitter that have been doing the round really since the pandemic, or since we've been returning to campus after the pandemic. The Twitter posts from lecturers who are on campus presenting to empty rooms, lecturers whose students just are not returning to campus. And both of these things get me thinking about, whether our kind of long-standing models of teaching and assessment, these traditional models that have been in place for well over 100 years, 200 years, whether they're becoming now in the current environment a kind of ritualistic performance that have got kind of diminishing relevance and value. We perform the lecture, we perform these assessment regimes, but increasingly the kind of learning that needs to take place for the world that we live in might not be happening underneath that performance of these sort of long-standing regimes. And it's a little bit like the Emperor's New Clothes. I actually think when you talk to people across universities, most people recognise on some level that we can't sustain these practices for much longer. But we keep carrying on, maybe in part because confronting the scale of the change we would need is so overwhelming. Like the structural inertia, I think one commentator used, and that's probably a good term. The structural inertia is so immense that it's difficult to contemplate the scale of change we may need to step away from this. Go off and things like essays, reports, presentations. We assume that in going off and making these things, students are actually learning all the required sub-skills of searching a library, reading critically, summarising and synthesising information and developing an argument. We assume in producing the artefact that they've learned those things. We don't see them doing any of that, but we infer that learning through the artefact that they've done that. And we now have these tools like ChatGPT that can replicate the artefact really successfully. So we can no longer rely on the artefact in the same way to infer learning. So I think fairly soon in the not too distant future, we really will need to rethink artefact-based assessment. We'll need to de-risk it. That either means, I think, invigilating it, which isn't authentic and I don't think we want to go back to, or making these kind of artefact-based assessments more formative and shifting our summative assessment to more practice-based assessment tasks. But that then opens a whole Pandora's box because our current business models in higher education don't really support this kind of assessment at scale. One of the reasons we rely on artefact-based assessment is it's kind of economically efficient. So this, if we step away from this mode of assessment towards more practice-based assessment, it will mean organisational disruption as well as educational disruption. We will need to develop new approaches to assessment that allow us to better observe and guide and assess the learning process itself and not just these artefacts. To me, that means programmatic assessment. For those of you who haven't heard of programmatic assessment, that really means fewer summative assessment points across a whole course, not just the units within a course. And those are highly integrative, highly authentic assessment tasks. So you may have one task at the end of each semester or even at the end of each year. And every other learning activity the student does in the year is formative only. So it's about developmenting students in a really personalised way with lots of feedback and iterative activities towards these highly authentic integrative tasks that sit at the program level. So that would be fairly significant organisational disruption if universities were move in that direction. I think the other points, though, and I think the issue is sort of put quite sharply here by these two commentators, that what ChatGPT really forces us to confront is the value of a graduate. Justin Brown, who is a professor at ECU, who has a very dry wit and always puts things really succinctly and sharply. He's from the School of Science, which at ECU runs our IT and our coding courses. And so he's looking at IT graduates and cybersecurity graduates and thinking, our students, those graduates who are in IT, are going to have to demonstrate what they're going to value add to an organisation that might be able to rely on a tool like this in the near future to do coding, for example. So graduates will need to be able to explain to employers how they're more useful than a chatbot. It is a challenge that's a challenge all of our graduates will face, I think, going into this sort of environment, particularly as the technology sophistication accelerates. And then, of course, there's that point from Texar at the bottom, that really sharply articulated point that we need a deep rethink of approaches to teaching, learning and assessment so that we can actually ensure that students have attained the skills and knowledge they need. And that last point is vital. The advice that Texar gave in their webinar was not only are universities meeting their responsibility to ensure that students have met their learning outcomes? Yes, of course, that's our obligation under the higher education standards, that we ensure our assessment has integrity so that we know that the students have met their learning outcomes they say they have. But more importantly, are our learning outcomes still the right ones? Are our learning outcomes the right ones? And this is a much more profound and significant question that universities will need to confront. So I want to sort of put this in context now. Because yes, okay, ChatGPT is important. We've all been talking about it for the last few months. And look, yes, it's disruptive. I'm almost sick of that word, disruption. But I kind of want us to reflect now for a moment on what else we are doing in our universities, because January 5th, my focus was, for my first few months of the year, my focus was ChatGPT, but I was already planning to be busy in 2023. ECU was already planning its response to a whole range of disruptions. And we have a new strategic plan, which I'm going to step you through briefly some of the items in that in a moment, and a new $850 million city campus, which is opening in 2026, that we need to figure out how to move an entire university into new classrooms with new ways of teaching. So we were already planning to be busy in 2023. And we were already responding to a range of social, economic and technological disruptions. So we are planning to improve our work in diversity, equity and inclusion to address long-standing social and economic inequalities affecting women, First Nations people, people with disability and LGBTQIA+ communities. As the job market becomes more volatile and people face life-changing careers, we were working to equip students to navigate this landscape with employability initiatives. We've been grappling for a while now with the disruption posed by contract cheating, and we're responding to the changing demands of students and employers about how we actually deliver higher education. We're looking at our academic calendar, for example. We're looking at our learning modes. All of these things are still really important, and we can't lose sight of them. But we will likely need to confront the implications of AI alongside these things during the life of our new strategic plan at ECU. And in my darker moments, I'm really angry at Silicon Valley, who lob these kind of so-called disruptions at the world. And I do sometimes wonder, are these things really solving a problem that people wanted solved? I'm not sure. I'm digressing there, I think. But it remains my job and ECU's commitment to progress all of these things, these really important things that you can see here. So I raise this for a really important reason, and that is it has implications for how I see the role of all units in universities' responses to generative AI. I think distributed leadership is what we need, because universities have got so much on the agenda. Universities are relied upon so much as social change agents and drivers of the economy, that there is a lot of pressure on universities to do a lot. I think we really need a distributed leadership approach to these things, and also to generative AI, and we'll come back to that in a moment. But I want to pause now for another quick conversation. So what we might do with this one, we might make this a little shorter. We might make this, let's make this one 9 minutes. If we come back at 1:40 my time, probably not. But what I want to know is, I want you to just share with each other, what else are your universities doing? And in your view, how compatible is that work with responding to generative AI? I think the second question is an important one, because in my view, we've probably got to make the work compatible. So what else are your unis doing, and how compatible is that work with responding to generative AI?
Yep, I've recreated the breakout room, slightly larger than last time, so that if we lost a couple of people, we still had a good enough number.
Right.
And then, Rowena, we will have time for question and answer at the end, won't we? And Rowena, back to you.
Great, thanks. Everyone's coming back again. I'm going to jump back into where we were. It was interesting hearing in my breakout room. I don't know if it was the same in everyone, but that ChatGPT, I'm going to use Deborah's term here, ChatGPT is currently a really loud noise in universities. And I think, you know, the risk maybe is that it becomes a focal point for the work that we do, rather than more part of the landscape we need to get students to work within. So I think it's, you know, how are we positioning it as something we need to deal with? Is it a problem we need to respond to, or the problem we need to respond to, or is it part of the landscape as we look at more other kind of significant and long-standing and maybe more important problems? But I think something every team needs to think about. So anyway, moving on probably to more positive things. So I'm going to skim quite quickly through these next slides, just by way of overview of some of the implications, I think, for universities, and particularly implications that affect the work that you all do in your teams. So first of all, there's a great post on LinkedIn from Selena Tenikov. Selena is actually a lecturer at ECU in our UniPEP program. And Selena asked ChatGPT to write 3 resignation letters. A resignation letter from a man, one from a woman, and one from someone who's non-binary. And the difference in language use, she said, was fascinating, and probably more fascinating was her discussion with her 11-year-old about why that might be. And so Selena's a fantastic teacher, and this is just, you know, a small illustration, I think, of how in the hands of a fantastic teacher, ChatGPT can be a really powerful teaching tool for a whole raft of things. So I think questions for you all to ask and to ask in your teams is, what lessons can ChatGPT illuminate for the students you work with? How can it be used as a teaching tool? And I'm sure you are already asking that question. I think also for me, there are other implications for equity, diversity and inclusion. ChatGPT does have the ability to make information more accessible and more intelligible to more people more quickly. So we can use generative AI to scaffold learning. You know, its plain language outputs can be used to provide access to disciplinary knowledge in advance of engaging with materials that are harder to understand. Many of us are positioning ChatGPT outputs a bit like Wikipedia with our students, and I think that seems right. You know, we can use it in that way, and it can be very beneficial, very beneficial. There are also implications, I think, for knowledge, for the kinds of knowledge we ask students to demonstrate. So we've touched on this a little bit already, but the fact that ChatGPT can successfully replicate artifact-based assessment, and particularly the ones that are based on declarative knowledge, really prompts us to interrogate when, why, and how we ask students to do these kinds of assignments. You know, are there things we could extract from our curriculum and instead put in other more important skills, things like communication, teamwork, creative thinking, emotional intelligence? That would be quite exciting. Then I think there are implications for information literacies, the evolution of information literacies, if you think about it, you know, using the card catalogue onto learning to use databases and Boolean searching. And now it's really learning to write a good prompt that will drive an algorithm to create an output. You know, there are implications for how we teach information literacy and the generation of information that really libraries and teams like yours will be driving. There are, of course, implications for academic integrity, and this is a theme that's come up a little bit in some of the discussions I've been in today, but I think particularly there is a need to distinguish between appropriate and inappropriate use, that is academic integrity, and effective and ineffective use, which is more about academic and professional practice. It's a bit like, you can cite Wikipedia, but that doesn't make it a good source for your assignments. So I think we have to have this nuance when we talk to students about ChatGPT. For me, it's not a simple matter of can you use it or not. It's that if you're going to use it, why would you? When is it good to use? When is it not good to use? I think also it's important that we don't take a one-size-fits-all approach across our disciplines, because I think there are different issues that arise depending on the particular kind of generative AI you're talking about and the discipline it's being used in. So I think a kind of a co-discovery approach between teams like yours and academics and students at the disciplinary level is probably needed to figure out how to navigate this in each disciplinary context. And also something we've touched on the use of AI detection tools really is still inadequate. So I don't think it's currently fair or responsible to rely on them for substantiating academic misconduct. That's at the moment. That might change, but currently I think that's the case. I've seen some commentary that ChatGPT will become a writing assistant or even take over the mechanics of writing in the same way that calculators took over the mechanics of arithmetic. Look, don't know about that. I think certainly I think there's a risk in not teaching writing. I think if you just simply look at the employer's view, communication is always right up the top of the top 10 employability skills that employers say they want in students. They will often hire for good communication skills over and above disciplinary knowledge. So we absolutely still need to be embedding communication development in our curriculum and be teaching the skill of writing. I think too, for me, I think this quote for me speaks to why we really need to teach writing, in that ChatGPT's outputs highly generic and highly neutral. It's a lovely quote, I think, from Eric Cole, that he can feel the meticulous neutrality of ChatGPT's outputs. That actually, if our students are going to come out as agentic and empowered people in the world, they need to be able to articulate with precision and nuance their own perspectives and their own views. So do we still need to teach writing? I have been asked that by a number of people, and I keep saying, yes, of course we do. I also think there are huge implications here for staff development. Not only staff development in understanding the tools themselves and how they're evolving, but also staff development in how to respond in terms of teaching, how to respond in terms of assessment design. I think we cannot underestimate the investment we will need to make in staff development. I don't think academics need to be experts in AI, not necessarily, but I think we will need local experts in each area, including in academic language and learning teams. I do think each team needs to figure out how to get up to speed and maintain kind of currency of knowledge in the area of generative AI. So what I might do, I was going to pause for discussion here, a third discussion, but what I might do is skip over this and go to more just general Q&A, because I think there might be some hot questions kind of popping up, and that'll give us a good 10 minutes to kind of have a discussion. But I was going to ask you to reflect on and share the roles that you and your team might play in your university's approach to generative AI and how you'll enable that. But that might be something that you continue to talk about after this session. I think, though, from where I sit, and this is my final slide before we go into Q&A, I think for me, although our kind of initial emergency response to ChatGPT that we've had over the last few months was probably driven largely by senior leaders because we had to make quick decisions and have a kind of a top-down approach, that can't really be sustained. We really need to kind of institutionalize our responses and start to develop that expertise, as I said, across every single team in the organization, from HR to IT, to research to academic language and learning. So each team in a university really needs to identify what it contributes to the discussion. So thinking about what insights need to come from all teams and how you ensure you're developing those. And then I think, as I said, academic integrity is really important, but it's not nearly the most important thing. I think the inherent biases in generative AI tools, the absences in terms of the information that they draw, and then the ethical and legal issues really need to be part and parcel of the education process if our students are going to be not only productive users of generative AI, but ethical users of generative AI as well. Okay, so I'll stop there and I'll stop sharing so we can get to more open discussion.
Excellent. Thank you, Rowena. Questions, burning questions, if you want to put up a virtual hand. I think we'll have like we can have 2-3 questions. So much to think about. Richard.
Hi everyone, sorry, I haven't got a camera here. Hello, Rowena, we have met in the past. I used to be over the road at Navitas. And I just spent 2 weeks on the South Coast, so I hope you're enjoying it. Yeah, my question is, we had this discussion with a few of us in one of the breakouts, and it's more an existential question. What's the purpose of a university? Given all of this, I mean, given when we had, the Turnitin and followed up by the various outsourcing that students could do possibly with their assignments, what is it that universities are attempting to do? If, I mean, to take that tongue-in-cheek comment about letting the technology get on with it, and we have interesting discussions in the cafe, it's only partially tongue-in-cheek, because I think learning and higher education institutions are of a higher order than just simply artifact output, and that let's call it metacognition of looking down from above at the process of generating that artifact and everything that goes into that. I was doing this for 30 years and it's a struggle. It's still a struggle after 30 years. You get better at it, but you never get perfect at it.
Yeah.
So this is a bit, I freely say I'm freelance now, so I have nobody to answer to. So essentially, this is a little bit cart pulling the horse as far as I'm concerned. We're looking very focused on this issue, but I think you've touched on it, going back to what is it that needs to be produced and how is that produced, depending on the discipline, and to what level of depth that needs to go, and what level of understanding that needs to go. So yeah, sorry to be very broad, but that's where I'm coming from.
Yeah, I think it doesn't have to be the cart pulling the horse. I think it's up to us. So I was chatting to George Siemens, who's a professor in learning analytics, about AI a few years ago, and somebody asked him, will AI take over the world? Will AI end up stealing all our jobs and doing everything for us? And he said, it will if we let it. It is up to us. It is up to every organisation. No one runs ECU but me and all my other senior leaders. We run the place. We get to decide. So I think I know what ECU's role is in our community and society. Our goal is to transform lives and enrich society. That's our mission. And so, yeah, I think it really is a moral decision that every institution is going to have to come to. Do you want fewer workers and cheaper labour, or do you want to support your local community by continuing to hire human beings to work, or do you want a chatbot to do it for you because it's cheaper? It really will become quite seriously, it will become a kind of a moral judgment.
Oh, I agree. It's what's the university's responsibility into the nature of truth? I'm getting very philosophical now, because that's what it comes down to me, because the truth of what you know and what you do is what you demonstrate in any discipline. But then the basis of that truth is questionable, arguably, in certain circumstances.
Yeah, interesting. That'll be, every university is different, to suggest that the university is a single thing. It's not. University of Melbourne's very different from Deakin, very different from ECU, very different from CSU. So I think every university is going to have to find its way.
Other questions? Joel, is that a hand up? Yes, physical hand up.
Yeah, a comment about the last comment. In terms of truth, I think in the end, you can go for scientific truths if you want, but I think in the end, as human beings, we can really only talk about our own truth, or own perception of reality or the world, or the way we interact with other people. And I think one of the major purposes of university and education in general is to assist students to be able to represent that effectively within the world, whether that's in their workplace or within their family.
I think we should be talking to students too. I think we will be surprised, I think, at how potentially at how valuable a student input is. I had a student email me last week, a student who studies creative writing, a student who's really terrified of the the fact that people now start to use ChatGPT to develop pitches for writing projects, and that her hard training and her hard-won skills in creative writing will just be overrun by generative AI. And in the same week, I also heard that a publishing company had closed down its pitching portal because it was being inundated by terrible pitches from people who just use ChatGPT to quickly generate a pitch for a book, a novel. So I think, yeah, we will have to help our students really be able to articulate what it is that they can do over and above generative AI. But we will have to kind of manage also, I think, in all of our contexts, this kind of inundation of not very good content coming out of these tools. You know, what do we want to do about that as a society?
Before we wrap up and thank Rowena, Alice has some information about our next CIS session. Alice, would you like to share that? Yes,
this has been so interesting, and I think we're all concerned about AI, but we're going to take a breather next time in May. I'm going to put
We've lost sound, Alice.
Oh, Alice, you're muted.
I'm muted.
Yeah.
I've been talking to myself again. Sorry.
No.
I was saying, Rowena, this has been really interesting, and that's at the top of our minds, AI, but we're going to make a move to turn away from this topic and hide ourselves a while from it with the next topic, which will be on the 2nd of May, 3:30 to 5 p.m. John Mani of our university ACU. He's in charge of a project called Inspire that's won a national award, and he will be talking about do's and don'ts of PowerPoint and presentation design, and myth busting for best learning and teaching practice. So back to practical tips about practice that we can deal with.
Yes. Can we give a round of applause for Rowena? Lots of ideas to think about. Thank you very much. And thank you to everybody who has participated. At one stage, we had 117, which is a CIS record. So thank you, and thank you. Thank you, Rowena, and thank you everyone for coming here today. Excellent presentation, excellent participation. Thank you. Have a great afternoon, evening, depending where you are. And see you all at the next session. Alice, can we stop the recording?
Oh, yes.